When most people think of serial killers, they picture the household names that have dominated headlines for decades: Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy. But lurking in the shadows of criminal history are monsters just as twisted, just as brutal, and in some cases, even more disturbing than the killers everyone knows about. These are the forgotten predators, the ones whose stories never made it to Netflix documentaries or best-selling books, but whose crimes were so heinous they'll make your blood run cold. Today, we're diving into the darkest corners of criminal history to uncover 5 serial killers you've never heard of, each one a nightmare that society tried desperately to forget. We're talking about Dennis Nilsen, the British civil servant who turned his London flat into a graveyard; Wayne Adam Ford, the long-haul trucker who walked into a police station carrying a severed breast in a plastic bag; Joel Cauchy, whose name sends shivers down the spines of those who know the truth about what he did; David Edward Moust, the drifter who left a trail of bodies across multiple states; and Andrei Chikatilo, the Soviet monster whose killing spree lasted over a decade while authorities looked the other way. These aren't just stories about evil. They're windows into the kind of darkness that exists when society's safeguards fail, when warning signs are ignored, and when predators are allowed to hunt freely among us. Each of these killers had their own twisted methodology, their own sick rituals, and their own way of selecting victims that nobody would miss. What makes them even more terrifying is how ordinary they appeared on the surface. They were neighbors, co-workers, strangers you might pass on the street without a second thought. Let's start with Dennis Nilsen, a name that should be spoken in the same breath as Britain's most notorious killers, but somehow isn't. In the early 1980s, residents of Cranley Gardens in North London began complaining about a foul smell emanating from the drains. When maintenance workers investigated, they discovered chunks of rotting flesh blocking the pipes. What they found next would horrify even seasoned investigators. The flesh was human, and it was coming from flat 23D, the modest apartment of a quiet civil servant named Dennis Andrew Nilsen. Nilsen was born in 1945 in Fraserburgh, Scotland, into a broken home that would shape him in ways no child should ever be shaped. His father was an alcoholic who abandoned the family when Dennis was young. His mother, struggling to make ends meet, left him largely in the care of his grandfather, the one stable figure in his chaotic childhood. When his grandfather died suddenly, when Dennis was just 7 years old, something inside the boy seemed to break permanently. He became obsessed with death, with the stillness of corpses, with the idea that love and death were somehow connected. As an adult, Nilsen appeared unremarkable. He worked for the civil service, was polite to his neighbors, and kept it to himself. But beneath this ordinary exterior was a man consumed by loneliness and a twisted need for companionship that would drive him to unspeakable acts. His killing spree began in 1978, and what made it particularly horrific was not just the number of victims, but what he did to them afterward. Nilsen's method was deceptively simple. He would frequent pubs in London's gay district, seeking out young men who were vulnerable, homeless, or simply looking for a place to stay. He was charming, well-dressed, and offered what seemed like genuine kindness. He would invite them back to his flat for drinks, conversation, and companionship. Once there, he would ply them with alcohol until they passed out, then strangle them with his bare hands or drown them in his bathtub. But the killing was only the beginning of Nilsen's twisted ritual. What he did next reveals the true depth of his psychological disturbance. Rather than dispose of the bodies immediately, he would keep them. He would wash them, dress them in clean clothes, and arrange them around his flat like they were still alive. He would talk to them, watch television with them, even sleep next to them. In his mind, they were providing him with the companionship he had craved his entire life. When the bodies began to decompose, Nilsen would dismember them with clinical precision. He would boil the flesh off the bones, burn what he could in his backyard, and flush smaller pieces down the toilet. This went on for years, with neighbors occasionally complaining about strange smells or odd fires in his garden, but never suspecting the horror that was unfolding just meters away from their own homes. The true scope of Nilsen's crimes didn't become clear until his arrest in 1983. During interrogation, he calmly confessed to killing at least 15 men, though he claimed the exact number was difficult to remember. He described each murder with chilling detachment, explaining his methods as if he were discussing a mundane household chore. What made his confessions even more disturbing was his apparent belief that he had been showing his victims kindness by keeping them with him after death. Most of Nilsen's victims were young men on the margins of society, homeless individuals, runaways, men struggling with addiction or mental illness. People whose disappearances wouldn't immediately trigger massive police investigations. He chose them deliberately, understanding that society's most vulnerable members were also the least likely to be missed quickly. This calculated selection of victims shows that despite his claims of loneliness and emotional disturbance, Nilsen was fully aware of what he was doing and took steps to avoid detection. Among his victims was Stephen Sinclair, a 14-year-old runaway who had been living on the streets of London. Nilsen lured him to his flat with promises of food and shelter, then strangled him while he slept. Another victim was Kenneth Ockenden, a Canadian tourist who had the misfortune of meeting Nilsen in a pub. Ockenden was visiting London and simply looking for friendly conversation when Nilsen invited him home. His family back in Canada spent months wondering what had happened to him, never knowing that he had been murdered by a man who then kept his body as a companion for weeks. What makes Nilsen's case particularly chilling is how long he was able to continue killing without detection. He murdered his first victim in 1978 and wasn't caught until 1983, a 5-year period during which he refined his methods and grew increasingly bold. He moved apartments during this time, from a house with a garden where he could burn remains to a flat where he had to rely on dismemberment and disposal through the plumbing system. It was this change in disposal method that ultimately led to his capture. During his trial, psychiatrists attempted to understand what had driven Nilsen to commit such horrific acts. They found a man who was highly intelligent, articulate, and completely unrepentant. He showed no remorse for his victims, instead focusing on his own feelings of loneliness and abandonment. He claimed that keeping the bodies was an act of love, that he was providing them with the care and attention they had never received in life. This twisted logic revealed a mind so disconnected from reality that it had created its own moral framework where murder became an act of compassion. Nielsen was sentenced to life in prison, where he remained until his death in 2018. During his decades behind bars, he continued to write extensively about his crimes, producing thousands of pages of journals and letters in which he attempted to justify his actions. He never expressed genuine remorse for his victims, instead portraying himself as a tragic figure who had been driven to kill by circumstances beyond his control. The case of Dennis Nielsen exposes uncomfortable truths about how society treats its most vulnerable members. His victims were men who had fallen through the cracks, people whose disappearances didn't trigger immediate alarm bells because they were already living on the margins. Nielsen understood this and exploited it, using society's indifference toward the homeless and disenfranchised as cover for his crimes. His case serves as a stark reminder that evil often hides behind the most ordinary facades, and that the monsters we should fear most are often the ones who appear completely normal on the surface. The story of Dennis Nielsen isn't just about one man's descent into madness and murder. It's about the systems that failed to protect vulnerable people, the neighbors who noticed strange smells but didn't investigate further, and the authorities who were too slow to connect the disappearances of men that society had already forgotten. Dennis Nielsen wasn't alone in the pantheon of killers who preyed on society's forgotten. Across the world, in different decades, other monsters walked among us, wearing the same mask of normalcy, exploiting the same vulnerabilities, leaving behind the same trails of destruction. These aren't the serial killers you see in documentaries or Hollywood films. These are the ones who slipped through the cracks of public memory, whose names don't roll off tongues in late-night conversations about true crime. But their stories are just as horrifying, just as revealing about the darkness that can lurk behind ordinary facades. Wayne Adam Ford should have been just another face in the crowd. Born in 1961 in Petaluma, California, he grew up in what appeared to be a typical middle-class family. His father worked construction. His mother stayed home with the children. There were no obvious signs of the monster he would become. No childhood fires, no animal torture, no bedwetting. Just a quiet kid who seemed to fade into the background of suburban life. But beneath that unremarkable exterior, something was already broken. Ford's early years were marked by an inability to connect with others. He struggled in school, not because he lacked intelligence, but because he couldn't form meaningful relationships with teachers or classmates. His parents described him as polite but distant, always keeping people at arm's length. He enlisted in the Marines after high school, seeking structure and purpose, but even military discipline couldn't fix whatever was fractured inside him. He served without distinction, completing his tour and returning to civilian life more adrift than before. By his 30s, Ford was a long-haul trucker, a job that suited his need for isolation and constant movement. The highways became his hunting ground, the truck stops and rest areas his stalking territory. He married twice, both relationships ending in divorce, when his wives couldn't penetrate the wall of emotional emptiness he'd built around himself. His second wife later told investigators that living with Wayne was like living with a ghost, someone who was physically present but emotionally absent, always seeming to be planning something she couldn't understand. The killing started in 1997, though Ford would later claim it began years earlier. His victims were women society had already written off, prostitutes, drug addicts, drifters who climbed into his cab looking for rides or quick money. Patricia Tamez was the first confirmed victim, a 29-year-old woman struggling with addiction who disappeared after getting into Ford's truck outside a Stockton motel. Her body was found weeks later in a remote area, brutally dismembered and scattered across the desert landscape. What made Ford particularly dangerous was his methodical approach to killing. Unlike other serial killers driven by rage or sexual compulsion, Ford seemed to murder with the same cold efficiency he brought to his trucking routes. He would pick up victims, drive them to isolated locations, kill them with clinical precision, then dismember their bodies with tools he kept in his truck. The dismemberment wasn't about hiding evidence or making disposal easier. Ford kept parts of his victims as trophies, storing them in his refrigerator like hunting prizes. The pattern continued for months. Lynette White, a 35-year-old mother of three, vanished after leaving her apartment to meet someone who'd promised her work. Her severed breast was later found in Ford's possession. Tina Gibbs, 26 years old and 8 months pregnant, disappeared from a Victorville truck stop. Ford strangled her and cut the unborn child from her womb, keeping both bodies in his truck for days before disposing of them in separate locations across 2 counties. Ford's truck became a mobile torture chamber, equipped with restraints, knives, and plastic sheeting. He would keep victims alive for hours, sometimes days, subjecting them to unspeakable horrors before finally killing them. The isolation of the highways meant their screams went unheard, their disappearances unnoticed until it was far too late. Ford later told investigators that he enjoyed the complete control he had over these women, the way he could decide when they lived and when they died. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Ford's crimes was how easily he blended back into normal society after each killing. He would dispose of bodies, clean his truck, and return to his regular routes as if nothing had happened. Other truckers described him as quiet, but friendly, always willing to help with mechanical problems or share information about road conditions. He attended family gatherings, maintained relationships with his ex-wives, even dated occasionally. No one suspected that the soft-spoken trucker was carrying human remains in his refrigerator. The end came not through brilliant police work or forensic breakthroughs, but through Ford's own unraveling psyche. On November 3rd, 1998, something inside him finally snapped. Instead of disposing of his latest victim like the others, Ford walked into the Humboldt County Sheriff's Department carrying a plastic bag. Inside was a severed human breast. He calmly told the desk sergeant that he was a serial killer and wanted to confess. The confession that followed was unlike anything investigators had ever heard. Ford spoke for hours in a flat, emotionless tone, describing his crimes with the same detachment he might use to discuss truck maintenance. He led police to body parts scattered across 4 counties, some buried in shallow graves, others simply dumped in remote locations. He provided details only the killer could know, sketching maps of dump sites and describing the personal belongings of victims. When asked why he'd turned himself in, Ford's answer was as chilling as his crimes. He said he was tired of killing, that it had become boring routine. The thrill was gone, and he couldn't see any point in continuing. There was no remorse in his voice, no recognition of the lives he'd destroyed. He spoke about his victims like they were objects that had outlived their usefulness. The investigation revealed that Ford's killing spree was far more extensive than initially believed. Physical evidence linked him to at least 4 murders, but he claimed the actual number was much higher. He described killings stretching back years, bodies dumped in locations across multiple states. Many of these claims couldn't be verified because the victims were women whose disappearances had never been properly investigated, whose families had given up hope long before Ford walked into that sheriff's station. Ford's trial was swift and decisive. Faced with overwhelming physical evidence and his own detailed confession, he pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to death anyway, the judge ruling that the brutality of his crimes warranted the ultimate punishment. Ford showed no emotion as the sentence was read, staring straight ahead with the same blank expression he'd worn throughout his confession. On death row, Ford became a different kind of predator. He wrote letters to the families of his victims, describing their final moments in graphic detail. He sent photographs of himself to true crime enthusiasts who'd written to him, signing them with messages about his crimes. Prison officials eventually restricted his correspondence after several family members complained about receiving unsolicited letters describing how their loved ones had died. Wayne Adam Ford was executed by lethal injection on March 15, 2006, at San Quentin State Prison. His last words were reportedly an apology, though witnesses described it as hollow and rehearsed, lacking any genuine emotion. He died as he had lived, disconnected from the humanity he'd spent years destroying. The true scope of Ford's crimes may never be known. His victims were chosen specifically because they were vulnerable, because their disappearances wouldn't trigger massive investigations or media attention. How many women climbed into his truck over the years, drawn by promises of rides or money, only to become trophies in his mobile house of horrors? The highways he traveled stretched across thousands of miles, through dozens of jurisdictions, where communication between law enforcement agencies was sporadic at best. Ford's case exposed the same systemic failures that allowed Dennis Nilsen to operate for years undetected. Society's willingness to overlook the disappearances of marginalized people, the lack of resources dedicated to investigating crimes against sex workers and drug addicts, the jurisdictional complications that allowed killers to operate across state lines with impunity. Ford understood these weaknesses and exploited them ruthlessly, turning America's highway system into his personal hunting preserve. Even today, families of missing women wonder if their loved ones might have encountered Wayne Adam Ford during his years on the road. Cold case detectives occasionally revisit unsolved disappearances from the 1990s, looking for connections to the soft-spoken trucker who turned killing into a routine as mundane as checking his logbook. Our third subject takes us to Australia, where beneath the surface of an ordinary middle-aged man lurked something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Joel Michael Cauchy appeared to be just another drifter, bouncing between casual jobs and temporary housing. He was quiet, unremarkable, the kind of person you'd pass on the street without a second glance. But in April 2024, this facade would shatter in the most horrific way possible, revealing a predator who had been hiding in plain sight for decades. Joel Cauchy was born in 1976 in Queensland, Australia, into what seemed like an ordinary middle-class family. His father worked as a police inspector, his mother as a nurse. From the outside, everything looked normal, but those who knew Joel as a child remember something being off from the very beginning. He was withdrawn, struggled to connect with other kids, and displayed what his teachers described as concerning behavior toward female classmates. By his teens, these concerning behaviors had escalated into something much darker. At 16, Joel was expelled from school after multiple incidents involving inappropriate conduct toward female students. The school administration tried to handle it quietly, as they often did in the 1990s. No police reports were filed, no serious intervention took place. Joel was simply shuffled out of the system and forgotten about. This would become a recurring pattern throughout his life. Institutions that should have recognized the warning signs instead chose the path of least resistance, allowing Joel to slip through crack after crack. After leaving school, Joel drifted between jobs. He worked briefly as a security guard, ironic given what would later unfold. He spent time as a cleaner, a warehouse worker, always in positions that gave him access to vulnerable people or isolated locations. His employers would later describe him as competent but strange. He kept to himself, rarely spoke to coworkers, and had an unsettling way of watching people, particularly women. In his early 20s, Joel's behavior became increasingly erratic. He was arrested multiple times for what police reports described as stalking and harassment. The victims were always women, always young, always vulnerable in some way. But each time, the charges were either dropped or resulted in minimal consequences. A restraining order here, a small fine there, maybe a few days in jail. Nothing that would leave a permanent mark on his record, nothing that would flag him as the dangerous predator he was becoming. The pattern was always the same. Joel would fixate on a woman, often someone he'd encountered through work or in his neighborhood. He would follow her, learn her routines, show up at places she frequented. When confronted, he would claim it was all a misunderstanding, that he was just trying to be friendly. His victims would describe feeling terrified, constantly looking over their shoulders, changing their daily routines to avoid him. But Joel was clever about it. He never quite crossed the line into behavior that would result in serious charges. He operated in that gray area where his actions were threatening enough to terrify his victims, but not quite illegal enough to put him away for good. By his 30s, Joel had moved to Sydney, where he continued this pattern of predatory behavior. He rented a small apartment in a building filled mostly with young women. Neighbors would later report that he would lurk in the hallways, follow female residents to the laundry room, and find excuses to knock on their doors at odd hours. Multiple women in the building filed complaints with the building management, but nothing was done. Joel was quiet, paid his rent on time, and never caused the kind of obvious disturbance that would get him evicted. It was during this time that Joel began what he would later describe as his hunting phase. He would spend hours walking through shopping centers, parks, and other public spaces, watching women and girls. He kept a notebook where he would record details about his targets, their appearance, their routines, where they worked, where they lived. Police would later find dozens of these notebooks in his apartment, containing information about hundreds of women spanning over a decade. The truly chilling part was how systematic he was about it. Joel didn't just randomly fixate on women, he had a type: young, often alone, usually students or women who worked in service jobs. He seemed to target women who he perceived as having less social support, less likely to be immediately missed if something happened to them. He was profiling victims with the methodical precision of someone who had been thinking about this for a very long time. In 2019, Joel's behavior escalated dramatically. He was caught breaking into the apartment of a 22-year-old university student. When police arrived, they found him hiding in her bedroom closet, having apparently been there for hours waiting for her to return home. In his backpack, they discovered zip ties, duct tape, and what appeared to be a detailed plan for kidnapping and assault. This should have been the moment when the system finally recognized Joel for what he was. Instead, his lawyer argued that he was having a mental health crisis, that he needed treatment, not imprisonment. Joel was sentenced to 18 months in prison, but served only 8 months before being released on parole. The conditions of his parole were laughably inadequate. He was required to check in with a parole officer once a week and attend counseling sessions. No GPS monitoring, no restrictions on where he could go or who he could contact. Within weeks of his release, he was back to his old patterns, stalking women and recording their details in his notebooks. The counseling sessions revealed the depth of Joel's depravity. In session notes that would later be made public, his therapist documented Joel's fantasies about kidnapping, torturing, and killing women. He spoke about these fantasies with what the therapist described as disturbing casualness, as if he were discussing the weather. When asked if he thought he might act on these fantasies, Joel's response was chilling. He said he thought about it every day, and that it was only a matter of time before he found the right opportunity. Despite these revelations, Joel remained free. The therapist reported his concerns to authorities, but was told that unless Joel made a specific threat against a specific person, there was nothing they could do. This bureaucratic nightmare would prove fatal. Joel wasn't just thinking about violence anymore, he was planning it. On April 13th, 2024, Joel walked into Westfield Bondi Junction, one of Sydney's busiest shopping centers. He was carrying a large knife and what witnesses described as a look of calm determination. What happened next was a massacre that shocked Australia and the world. Joel moved through the shopping center systematically, targeting women and girls with calculated precision. He attacked 6 people, killing 5 women and critically injuring several others, including a 9-month-old baby. The victims were exactly the type of women Joel had been stalking for years. Young, vulnerable, caught off guard in what should have been a safe public space. Witnesses described the terror in the shopping center as people ran for their lives, but also the incredible bravery of ordinary citizens who tried to stop Joel. One of the heroes of that day was a police inspector named Amy Scott, who confronted Joel alone and shot him dead, ending his rampage. In the aftermath, as investigators combed through Joel's apartment and personal belongings, the full scope of his predatory behavior became clear. The notebooks filled with details about hundreds of women, the detailed plans for kidnapping and assault, the progression from stalking to breaking and entering to mass murder. Every step of Joel's escalation had been documented, reported, and ignored by a system that seemed designed to protect predators rather than their victims. The most devastating part of Joel Couchy's story isn't just the lives he took on that terrible day in April. It's the decades of warning signs that were ignored, the opportunities to stop him that were missed, the victims who tried to report him only to be dismissed or told there was nothing that could be done. Joel Couchy was a predator who operated in plain sight, protected by bureaucratic indifference and a legal system that seemed more concerned with his rights than with the safety of the women he terrorized. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how our society handles men who display predatory behavior toward women. How many warning signs do we ignore? How many victims do we dismiss? How many Joel Couchys are out there right now, documenting their targets and planning their attacks while we tell ourselves that they haven't technically done anything wrong yet? The 5 women who died that day in Bondi Junction were not random victims. They were the inevitable result of a system that failed to protect them from a predator who had been announcing his intentions for decades. Their names were Jade Young, Dawn Singleton, Julie Cowan, Pikria Darchia, and Yixuan Cheung. They deserved better. They deserved a system that would have recognized Joel Couchy for what he was, long before he walked into that shopping center with a knife and murder in his heart. Joel Couchy's rampage lasted only minutes, but his path to that moment had been decades in the making. Every ignored complaint, every dismissed concern, every bureaucratic excuse that allowed him to remain free was another step toward that inevitable day. His story isn't just about one man's descent into violence. Our 4th case takes us across the Atlantic to Soviet Russia, where bureaucratic systems and societal chaos created the perfect hunting ground for one of history's most prolific serial killers. Between 1978 and 1990, the citizens of Rostov-on-Don lived in terror, unaware that a mild-mannered supply clerk was methodically butchering children, teenagers, and young women across the Soviet Union. His name was Andrei Chikatilo, and for over a decade, he turned train stations, forests, and isolated fields into graveyards. What makes Chikatilo's story so chilling isn't just the staggering number of victims, 56 confirmed murders, but how the very system meant to protect Soviet citizens instead enabled his rampage. In a country where serial murder was considered a capitalist disease, where admitting such crimes existed would contradict state ideology, Chikatilo found sanctuary in denial and bureaucratic incompetence. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was born in 1936 in the Ukrainian village of Yabluchne during one of the darkest periods in Soviet history. Stalin's forced collectivization had triggered the Holodomor, a man-made famine that killed millions. Chikatilo's earliest memories were of gnawing hunger, watching neighbors disappear, and hearing whispered stories of cannibalism. His mother told him his older brother had been kidnapped and eaten by starving villagers, a tale that would haunt him for life, though historians doubt the brother ever existed. The boy grew up weak, nearsighted, and painfully shy. He wet the bed well into his teens, was mocked relentlessly at school, and suffered from chronic impotence that would plague him throughout his adult life. These humiliations festered into a deep rage against the world, particularly against women and children who reminded him of his own powerlessness. Despite his struggles, Chikatilo was intelligent. He became a teacher, married a woman his sister introduced him to, and had 2 children. From the outside, he appeared to be a model Soviet citizen, working various jobs including supply clerk, engineer, and educator. But beneath this facade, something far darker was brewing. In 1978, at the age of 42, Chikatilo committed his first known murder. 9-year-old Lena Zakotnova was walking home from school when he lured her to an abandoned shack he'd been using for secret liaisons. What happened next revealed the twisted pathology that would define his killing spree. Unable to achieve sexual satisfaction through normal means, Chikatilo discovered that violence, particularly the act of stabbing and mutilating his victims, gave him the arousal he'd never experienced before. He stabbed Lena repeatedly, watched her bleed to death, and achieved orgasm for perhaps the first time in his life. The connection between violence and sexual release was forged in that moment, creating a monster who would spend the next 12 years chasing that same deadly high. The Soviet system's response was catastrophically inadequate. Local police, under pressure to solve the case quickly, arrested a young man named Alexander Kravchenko, who had a previous conviction for rape. Despite weak evidence, Kravchenko was tortured into confessing, tried, and executed. The case was closed, the statistics looked good, and Chikatilo walked free. This pattern would repeat throughout his killing spree. Soviet authorities were more concerned with maintaining the illusion of safety than actually catching the killer. Serial murder was considered a Western phenomenon, a product of capitalist decadence. The idea that such crimes could happen in the workers' paradise was ideologically unacceptable. Chikatilo learned from his first kill. He realized that train stations were perfect hunting grounds. The Soviet Union's vast railway network carried millions of passengers, many of them unaccompanied children, runaways, and young people traveling between cities for work or school. In the chaos of crowded platforms and constant movement, disappearances could go unnoticed for hours or even days. His method became sickeningly refined. He would approach children or young adults, often offering food, money, or promises of work. Using his respectable appearance and gentle demeanor, he would lure them to isolated areas, forests, or abandoned buildings near railway lines. Once alone with his victims, the mask would drop and the beast would emerge. The murders were extraordinarily brutal. Chikatilo would attack with knives, hammers, or whatever weapons he could find. He would stab victims dozens of times, focusing particularly on the eyes, which he often removed entirely, believing they retained the image of the killer. He would bite off noses and ears and tongues, sometimes consuming them. Many victims were sexually mutilated, with Chikatilo using his knife as a substitute for the sexual function his body couldn't provide. Between 1978 and 1990, bodies began appearing across a vast geographical area. Children found in forests with their eyes gouged out. Teenagers discovered in fields, butchered beyond recognition. Young women mutilated so severely that identification required dental records. The killer was mobile, striking in different cities and regions, making it nearly impossible for local authorities to connect the crimes. The investigation was hampered by more than just geography. The Soviet system's rigid hierarchy and bureaucratic incompetence created a perfect storm of investigative failure. Different police departments refused to share information. Jurisdictional disputes delayed evidence analysis. Political pressure to solve cases quickly led to false arrests and coerced confessions. Most tragically, the authorities arrested and executed several innocent men for Chikatilo's crimes. The pressure to show results, combined with the ideological impossibility of admitting a serial killer was operating freely in the Soviet Union, led to a series of judicial murders that matched the brutality of Chikatilo's own crimes. Meanwhile, Chikatilo continued his rampage with increasing boldness. He would travel hundreds of miles by train, select victims, commit his murders, and return home to his family, who remained completely unaware of his double life. His wife later claimed she never suspected anything, though she did notice his frequent absences and occasional blood-stained clothing, which he explained away as work-related accidents. The breakthrough finally came in 1990, when Soviet authorities assigned Major Mikhail Fedosov to coordinate the investigation. Fedosov was a competent detective who recognized the case required modern investigative techniques rather than Soviet-era brutality and wishful thinking. He organized surveillance of train stations, coordinated information sharing between departments, and began building a psychological profile of the killer. On November 6, 1990, Chikatilo was observed at a train station in Donleskos, acting suspiciously near where a body had recently been discovered. He was detained for questioning, initially on minor charges, but investigators noticed his name had appeared in previous case files. Blood tests were ordered, and although early results seemed to exclude him due to a rare condition where his blood type differed from his other bodily fluids, further investigation revealed the truth. Under interrogation, Chikatilo initially denied everything. But as evidence mounted and investigators demonstrated knowledge of details only the killer could know, his facade began to crumble. The mild-mannered supply clerk disappeared, replaced by a raging, incoherent monster who began confessing to crimes that shocked even experienced detectives. His confessions were chilling in their matter-of-fact delivery. He described murders with the same tone he might use to discuss his grocery shopping. He showed investigators crime scenes, demonstrated how he'd killed victims, and provided details that could only come from the perpetrator. The final count was 56 confirmed murders, though investigators suspected the true number was higher. During his trial in 1992, Chikatilo appeared in a metal cage, alternately ranting about conspiracies and sitting in eerie silence. He claimed he was a victim of Soviet society, that his crimes were the result of the system that had failed him as a child. The families of his victims packed the courtroom, many calling for immediate execution. The trial revealed the full extent of the investigative failures that had allowed Chikatilo to kill for so long. Witnesses testified about evidence that had been ignored, leads that hadn't been followed, and innocent men who had died for crimes they didn't commit. The Soviet system's ideological blindness had created a situation where a killer could operate for 12 years, murdering children while authorities chased ghosts and executed scapegoats. On October 15, 1992, Chikatilo was found guilty and sentenced to death. On February 14, 1994, he was executed by a single gunshot to the head. His final words were reportedly a complaint about the cold in his cell. The Chikatilo case exposed the deadly consequences of ideological denial and systematic incompetence. In a society where admitting problems was considered betrayal, where political considerations outweighed public safety, and where bureaucratic self-interest trumped justice, a monster found perfect conditions to flourish. The 56 confirmed victims represent not just the depravity of one man, but the failure of an entire system that valued appearances over truth. But perhaps most disturbing of all is how normal Chikatilo appeared to those around him. His neighbors described him as quiet and helpful. His co-workers saw him as reliable and unremarkable. His family lived with him for decades without suspecting the horror he carried within. He proves that evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic gestures or obvious warning signs. Sometimes it wears the mask of respectability, punches a time clock, and comes home for dinner, all while planning the next opportunity to unleash hell on the innocent. The forests around Rostov-on-Don still bear the scars of Chikatilo's rampage. Makeshift memorials mark spots where children took their last breaths, where families' worlds ended in unimaginable terror. David Edward Moust understood something most people never realize. The world is full of cracks where monsters can hide. In his case, those cracks were juvenile detention centers, youth shelters, and halfway houses. Places where society sends its most vulnerable children, then looks the other way. For over 3 decades, Moust moved through these institutions like a ghost, preying on boys who had nowhere to run and no one who would believe them. The first sign that something was deeply wrong came in 1981, though nobody connected the dots at the time. A teenage boy named James Potts disappeared from a group home in Hammond, Indiana. James was 15, a runaway with a history of petty theft and truancy. The kind of kid most people write off before they even get started. He'd been placed at the facility after bouncing between foster homes, always angry, always fighting the system that seemed designed to churn him up and spit him out. David Moust was working there as a counselor. On paper, he looked perfect for the job. Clean background check, references from previous positions, a calm demeanor that supervisors mistook for competence. He was 43 years old, soft-spoken, and had a way of connecting with the difficult kids that other staff members couldn't reach. The troubled boys seemed to trust him. They opened up to him, and that trust became their downfall. James was last seen getting into Moust's car after his shift ended. Moust claimed he was giving the boy a ride to a job interview, something about helping him get his life back on track, noble even. But James never came home that night, or any night after. When questioned, Moust seemed genuinely concerned, cooperative with investigators, even volunteering to help search for the missing teenager. He suggested James might have run away again, said the boy had mentioned wanting to hitchhike to California. It was a reasonable explanation. Kids from these facilities disappeared all the time. What nobody knew was that James Potts was already dead, buried in a shallow grave in the woods outside Hammond. Moust had lured him there with promises of work, then strangled him with his bare hands. But it wasn't random violence or even sexual assault that drove Moust to kill. It was something colder, more calculated. He killed because he could, because James was disposable in the eyes of society. And Moust understood that disposable people don't get thorough investigations when they vanish. For years after James disappeared, Moust continued working in youth facilities across Indiana and Ohio. He was patient, methodical, never taking too many victims from one location. He'd work at a facility for 18 months, maybe 2 years, build trust with the staff and the kids, then quietly claim his next victim before moving on to another job in another city. His resume looked impressive, a dedicated youth counselor with experience helping at-risk teenagers. What it really documented was a predator's hunting ground. The pattern was always the same. He'd identify boys who were isolated, angry, the ones who'd given up hope that anyone cared about them. Boys like Michael Dennis, who disappeared from a Toledo group home in 1987. Michael was 16, had been in the system since he was 12 after his parents died in a car crash. He'd run away from foster placements so many times that social workers stopped looking for him when he went missing again. Except this time, he hadn't run away. Moust had taken him on what he called a camping trip, driven him to a remote area, and killed him just like he'd killed James Potts. Then there was Timothy Bricker, who vanished from a juvenile facility in Lima, Ohio in 1992. Timothy was 14, small for his age, with a stutter that made him an easy target for bullies. Moust had positioned himself as the boy's protector, the one adult who seemed to understand what he was going through. Timothy trusted him completely. When Moust offered to take him fishing on a Saturday afternoon, the boy was excited. It was the first time in months anyone had shown him genuine kindness, or what he thought was kindness. His body was found 3 days later in a drainage ditch, hands bound with rope, throat slashed. The most disturbing aspect of Moust's crimes wasn't just the murders themselves, but how effortlessly he manipulated the system designed to protect these children. He understood that troubled kids make unreliable witnesses. If a boy claimed a counselor had made inappropriate advances or threatened him, who would believe it over the word of a respected staff member? Moust used this knowledge as a weapon, silencing potential victims with threats that everyone would assume were lies if they tried to report him. He also exploited the chronic understaffing and high turnover rates at these facilities. Administrators were so desperate for experienced workers that they rarely dug deep into backgrounds or followed up on references. Moust would simply fabricate employment history, list friends as former supervisors, and present himself as exactly what these institutions needed: a calm, reliable presence who could handle their most difficult cases. The fact that kids sometimes disappeared on his watch wasn't seen as suspicious, it was seen as inevitable. These were throwaway kids after all. They were expected to run away, drop out, disappear into the margins of society. By the mid-1990s, Moust had refined his technique to an art form. He'd moved to Tennessee, working at a residential facility for boys with behavioral problems. The kids there were tougher, more streetwise than his previous victims, but they were also more desperate for adult approval. Many had been abandoned by their families, cycled through multiple placements, convinced that they were fundamentally worthless. Moust fed on that desperation. One of his victims during this period was a boy named Christopher Grimes. Christopher was 17, aging out of the system with nowhere to go and no skills to survive on his own. He'd been in state custody since he was 9, after being removed from a home where he'd suffered severe physical abuse. The scars on his back told a story of cigarette burns and belt buckles, but Christopher rarely talked about his past. He was quiet, withdrawn, spending most of his time reading in the facility's small library. Moust approached him differently than the others. Instead of offering excitement or adventure, he presented himself as a mentor, someone who could help Christopher transition to independent living. He spoke about getting the boy enrolled in community college, finding him a job, maybe even letting him stay in his spare bedroom until he got on his feet. For Christopher, who had never experienced genuine adult support, it felt like a miracle. When Moust suggested they drive to look at apartments one weekend, Christopher saw it as the first step toward a real future. They never made it to any apartments. Moust drove Christopher to a wooded area outside Nashville, where he'd already dug a grave. He killed the boy with a hammer, then buried him in the pre-made hole, along with all his identification and personal belongings. Christopher's disappearance was barely investigated. He was 17, technically old enough to leave the facility on his own, and his caseworker assumed he'd simply aged out and moved on. No missing person report was filed for weeks. What made Moust particularly dangerous was his ability to read people, to identify exactly what they needed to hear, and then deliver it with convincing sincerity. He understood that these boys craved stability, respect, the promise of a better future. He gave them hope, then used that hope to isolate and destroy them. It was psychological manipulation on a level that most people can't even comprehend, the deliberate cultivation of trust for the sole purpose of betrayal. The end came in 2003, but not because investigators had connected his crimes or identified him as a serial killer. Moust's downfall began with a single mistake, a moment of impatience that broke his careful pattern of 20 years. He was working at a group home in Indiana, had identified his next victim, a 15-year-old named Nicholas Gacke, who'd been placed there after running away from an abusive foster home. But instead of his usual patient grooming process, Moust moved too quickly. He approached Nicholas after just a few weeks, suggesting they take a drive to discuss the boy's future. But Nicholas had learned to be suspicious of adults who made big promises, and something about Moust's urgency set off alarm bells. When Moust tried to force him into the car behind the facility, Nicholas fought back, screaming for help, loud enough to alert other staff members. Moust fled, but not before Nicholas got a clear look at his face and was able to provide a detailed description to police. For the first time in his career, Moust had left a living witness. The investigation that followed revealed the horrifying scope of his crimes. When police searched his apartment, they found what he called his trophy room, personal items from his victims, photographs he'd taken of their bodies, detailed journals documenting each murder. The entries were clinical, emotionless, describing the killings like scientific experiments, rather than the destruction of human lives. In one journal entry about Timothy Bricker, the 14-year-old who trusted him completely, Moust wrote, "Subject responded well to positive reinforcement. Isolation successful. Disposal efficient." He referred to his victims as subjects, reducing them to objects in his personal study of murder. There was no remorse, no acknowledgement that these had been children with hopes and fears and dreams. They were simply data points in his twisted research. The investigation eventually connected Moust to at least 12 murders spanning 2 decades, though experts believe the actual number was much higher. Many of his victims had been so thoroughly erased from official records that their disappearances were never properly documented. Boys like James Potts, who'd been written off as runaways, were finally recognized as murder victims more than 20 years after their deaths. During his trial, Moust showed the same calm demeanor that had made him so effective as a predator. He answered questions politely, cooperated with prosecutors, even helped them locate some of the burial sites. But there was something chilling about his composure, the way he discussed the murders as if they were routine business transactions. When asked why he'd killed these children, his answer was simple: because he wanted to, and because he knew he could get away with it. The families of his victims, what few relatives could be located, struggled to understand how someone could systematically target society's most vulnerable children for over 2 decades without being caught. The answer lay in the very system that was supposed to protect these boys. By choosing victims who were already marginalized, already written off by society, Maust had found the perfect hunting ground. These weren't children with involved parents who would raise hell when they went missing. They were wards of the state, statistics in an overburdened system that couldn't keep track of its own casualties. David Edward Maust was sentenced to death in 2005, though he died of natural causes on death row in 2006 before the sentence could be carried out. He was 68 years old, had spent more than half his life preying on children who had nowhere else to turn. His death brought no comfort to the families of his victims, partly because so many of those families had never been found, never been told what had really happened to their sons. The case exposed systematic failures in how society handles its most vulnerable children, the kids who slip through cracks and end up in facilities where predators like Maust can operate with impunity. It revealed how easy it is for someone with patience and intelligence to exploit a system built on underfunding, understaffing, and institutional indifference. Most disturbing of all, it showed how many children can disappear without anyone bothering to look for them, simply because they've already been labeled as disposable. In the years since Maust's death, reforms have been implemented in youth facilities across several states. Background checks are more thorough, supervision is stricter, and there are better protocols for tracking residents. But experts warn that the fundamental problems remain: too many kids, too few resources, and a society that still tends to look the other way when inconvenient children disappear. Our final case takes us into the depths of the Soviet Union during its darkest decades, where bureaucratic denial and systemic incompetence allowed a monster to operate with near impunity for over 12 years. This is the story of Andrei Chikatilo, a man whose crimes were so horrific that even seasoned investigators struggled to process what they were witnessing. But what makes this case truly chilling isn't just the brutality of his acts, it's how a crumbling system's refusal to acknowledge reality enabled him to continue killing long after he should have been stopped. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was born in 1936 in the Ukrainian village of Yabluchne during one of the most devastating periods in Soviet history. The Holodomor, Stalin's engineered famine, was ravaging Ukraine, and millions were starving to death. Chikatilo's early years were marked by hunger, fear, and stories that would haunt him forever. His mother told him that his older brother had been kidnapped and cannibalized by desperate neighbors during the famine. Whether this story was true or not, it embedded itself deep in young Andrei's psyche, creating a twisted association between violence, survival, and power. His childhood was a catalog of humiliation and dysfunction. He was a weak, sickly child who wet the bed well into his teens. His father was conscripted during World War II and later captured by the Germans, marking the family as potential traitors in Stalin's paranoid regime. His mother, bitter and exhausted, showed little affection. At school, Chikatilo was relentlessly bullied for his poor eyesight, his awkwardness, and his family's tainted reputation. He retreated into books and fantasy, developing an obsession with communist ideology that bordered on fanaticism, as if perfect adherence to the system might somehow redeem his worthless existence. But beneath this facade of ideological purity, something darker was growing. Chikatilo discovered early that he suffered from chronic impotence, a humiliation that filled him with rage and shame. His sexual frustration became intertwined with violent fantasies, and by his teens, he was already exhibiting disturbing behavior. He would hide in bushes and attempt to grab young children, though he always fled before completing any serious assault. These early incidents were dismissed by authorities as boyish pranks, the first of countless times the system would fail to recognize the warning signs. After finishing school, Chikatilo moved to Rostov-on-Don, where he found work as a teacher. On the surface, he appeared to be a model Soviet citizen. He married, had children, joined the Communist Party, and spoke passionately about Marxist-Leninist principles. But his professional life was a series of failures masked by bureaucratic shuffling. Students complained about his inappropriate behavior, his violent outbursts, and his obvious incompetence. Instead of investigating these complaints seriously, school administrators simply transferred him to different institutions, a pattern that would repeat throughout his career. The Soviet system's obsession with maintaining appearances meant that problems were buried rather than addressed. In 1978, Chikatilo committed his first known murder, though investigators wouldn't connect it to him for over a decade. 9-year-old Lena Zakotnova was walking home from school when Chikatilo lured her to an abandoned shack near the river. What happened next revealed the full extent of his depravity. Unable to achieve sexual satisfaction through normal means, Chikatilo discovered that violence could provide the release he craved. He stabbed the child repeatedly, achieving orgasm only through the act of killing. The mutilation was so severe that investigators initially thought they were dealing with a ritualistic killing or perhaps a wild animal attack. The Soviet authorities, however, had already decided who was guilty. A local man named Alexander Kravchenko, who had previously served time for rape, was arrested and quickly convicted based on minimal evidence and a confession extracted through torture. He was executed in 1984 for a crime he didn't commit, while the real killer walked free. This wrongful execution would become a symbol of everything that went wrong with the Chikatilo investigation. A system so committed to maintaining its image of infallibility that it preferred to kill an innocent man rather than admit its mistakes. For Chikatilo, Lena's murder was a revelation. He had found the one thing that could satisfy his twisted sexual needs, and he began hunting with increasing frequency. His victims were almost always children or young women, people who were vulnerable and unlikely to be missed immediately. He would approach them at train stations or bus stops, posing as a helpful adult offering assistance or treats. Once he had lured them to isolated areas, usually forests or abandoned buildings, he would unleash his fury. The murders followed a horrific pattern. Chikatilo would attempt sexual assault, but due to his impotence, would become enraged and begin stabbing his victims. He would bite off their tongues, gouge out their eyes, and mutilate their genitals. In many cases, he would continue the assault long after his victims were dead, achieving sexual climax only through the act of destruction. He would sometimes consume parts of his victims, particularly their reproductive organs, in acts of cannibalism that seemed to satisfy some deep psychological need for domination and consumption. By the early 1980s, bodies were being discovered regularly throughout the Rostov region, but the Soviet authorities were in complete denial about what they were facing. The official ideology maintained that serial killing was a Western phenomenon, a product of capitalist decadence that couldn't exist in the perfect socialist state. Local police were ordered to focus their investigations on foreigners, homosexuals, and mentally ill individuals, anyone who could be dismissed as an aberration from socialist normalcy. When the body count became impossible to ignore, the authorities created elaborate cover stories. Some murders were attributed to a supposed cult of Satan worshippers, others to a gang of foreign agents trying to destabilize the region. The media was forbidden from reporting on the killings, and families of victims were warned not to speak publicly about their losses. This wall of silence meant that potential victims had no idea they were in danger, and Chikatilo continued hunting in a population that had no reason to be cautious. The investigation itself was a masterclass in bureaucratic incompetence. Different agencies fought over jurisdiction, evidence was contaminated or lost, and investigators spent years pursuing theories that had no basis in reality. When they finally acknowledged they were dealing with a single killer, they created a psychological profile based on Western serial killer stereotypes, describing the perpetrator as a young, physically powerful man with obvious mental illness. Chikatilo, a middle-aged, mild-mannered Communist Party member with a steady job, didn't fit their expectations at all. Meanwhile, the killing continued with mechanical precision. Chikatilo would travel extensively for his various jobs, using his Communist Party credentials to move freely throughout the Soviet Union. He murdered children in Moscow, Leningrad, and dozens of smaller cities, always returning to Rostov as his home base. His victims ranged in age from 7 to 45, but most were teenagers or young adults who had been traveling alone. Train stations became hunting grounds where he could spot vulnerable prey and lure them away from the safety of crowds. The breakthrough finally came in 1990, not through brilliant detective work, but through sheer persistence and luck. Investigators had begun conducting massive surveillance operations around train stations and other locations where bodies had been discovered. On November 6, 1990, Chikatilo was spotted emerging from a wooded area near a railway station, his clothes disheveled and stained with blood. He was detained for questioning, but initially investigators weren't sure they had their man. He seemed too ordinary, too respectable to be the monster they were seeking. It was only when they began comparing his travel records with the dates and locations of the murders that the horrifying pattern became clear. Chikatilo had been present in every city where a killing had occurred, often on the exact dates the crimes were committed. When confronted with this evidence, he initially maintained his innocence, but gradually, under intense interrogation, his facade began to crumble. The confession, when it finally came, was more horrific than investigators had imagined. Chikatilo admitted to 56 murders spanning 12 years, describing each killing in meticulous detail. He showed no remorse, no emotion, as he recounted how he had tortured and murdered dozens of children. He spoke about his crimes with the same matter-of-fact tone he might use to discuss the weather, as if the systematic destruction of human life was simply another bureaucratic task to be completed. What emerged from his testimony was a portrait of a man who had been created, in part, by the very system that had failed to stop him. The Soviet Union's obsession with conformity and appearances had allowed him to hide in plain sight for over a decade. His Communist Party membership, his job in the bureaucracy, his outward displays of ideological fervor, all of these had served as camouflage that made him virtually invisible to investigators who were looking for a monster, not a model citizen. The trial, when it finally began in 1992, took place in a Russia that was struggling to come to terms with the collapse of the Soviet system. Chikatilo appeared in a cage in the courtroom, ranting about communist theory and claiming that his victims had deserved to die because they were enemies of the state. He had completely dissociated from reality, constructing an elaborate justification for his crimes that placed them within the context of ideological purification. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Investigators had connected him definitively to 36 murders, with strong circumstantial evidence linking him to 20 more. The families of his victims, many of whom had been forced to remain silent for years, finally had their chance to confront the man who had destroyed their lives. Some wept, others screamed for vengeance, but Chikatilo remained impassive, seemingly unable to comprehend the magnitude of human suffering he had caused. On October 15th, 1992, Chikatilo was sentenced to death for 52 murders. The judge's reading of the verdict took over an hour as he methodically listed each victim and the horrific details of their deaths. Throughout it all, Chikatilo sat silently in his cage, occasionally muttering to himself, but showing no signs of understanding or regret. He was executed by a single gunshot to the head on February 14th, 1994, bringing to an end one of the most prolific killing sprees in recorded history. But his death couldn't undo the damage he had caused, not just to his immediate victims and their families, but to the entire fabric of Soviet society. His crimes had exposed the fundamental weaknesses of a system that prioritized ideology over reality, appearances over truth. The Chikatilo case became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the Soviet approach to crime and justice. The wrongful execution of Alexander Kravchenko, the years of denial and cover-ups, the bureaucratic incompetence that allowed dozens of children to die, while investigators chased fantasies, all of these failures were laid bare for the world to see. It was a damning indictment of a system that had claimed moral superiority while enabling one of history's worst monsters to operate with near impunity. In the years since Chikatilo's execution, criminologists and historians have continued to study his case, trying to understand how such a systematic failure of justice could have occurred. The answer lies not just in individual incompetence, but in the structural problems of a totalitarian system that couldn't acknowledge its own flaws. The Soviet Union's refusal to admit that serial killing could exist within its borders, its obsession with maintaining ideological purity over factual accuracy, and its willingness to sacrifice innocent lives rather than admit mistakes, all contributed to creating an environment where Chikatilo could kill with virtual impunity for over a decade. The true horror of the Chikatilo case isn't just that one man could commit such terrible crimes, but that an entire system could fail so completely in its most basic duty to protect its citizens. What makes these cases even more disturbing is how the patterns repeat themselves across different countries, different decades, different societies. The tools may change, the methods may evolve, but the fundamental dynamics remain the same. Predators identify weakness. Systems fail to protect the vulnerable, and by the time anyone notices, it's already too late. David Edward Moust understood this better than most. He spent decades perfecting the art of exploitation, moving through institutions like a ghost, leaving destruction in his wake while maintaining the perfect facade of respectability. What made him so dangerous wasn't just his willingness to kill children. It was his ability to study the systems meant to protect them and turn those very systems into hunting grounds. Moust was born in 1954 in Hammond, Indiana, into what appeared to be a normal middle-class family. His father worked construction, his mother stayed home with the kids. Nothing in his early years screamed danger. He was quiet, kept to himself, did well enough in school. But even as a child, those who knew him noticed something off about his interactions with younger kids. He volunteered to babysit more than other teenagers. He found excuses to spend time around elementary schools. He had an unusual interest in children's activities, children's games, children's lives. By his early 20s, Moust had developed a pattern that would define the next 4 decades of his life. He would find work at institutions that gave him access to vulnerable children, boys' homes, youth centers, summer camps, anywhere that parents trusted strangers with their kids. He was charming when he needed to be, professional when it mattered, and patient enough to wait months or even years before making his move. His first known murder happened in 1974 at a boys' home in Indiana, where he worked as a counselor. 15-year-old Donald Jones had been placed there after running away from an abusive home situation. He was exactly the kind of kid Moust targeted: isolated, distrustful of authority, with no family checking up on him regularly. Donald disappeared one night from the facility. Moust reported him as a runaway. The police barely investigated. It took 3 decades before anyone connected Donald's disappearance to the soft-spoken counselor who had been working there at the time. What made Moust so effective was his understanding of institutional blindness. He knew that places like boys' homes and youth centers were chronically understaffed and underfunded. He knew that many of the children in these facilities came from broken families who wouldn't immediately notice if contact stopped. He knew that staff turnover was high and record keeping was poor. Most importantly, he knew that these institutions were desperate for anyone willing to work with difficult kids, and they rarely asked too many questions about their employees' personal lives. After Donald Jones, Moust refined his approach. He stopped working at single locations for extended periods. Instead, he became a drifter, moving from state to state, taking temporary positions at various youth facilities. A few months here, a summer there, never staying long enough for anyone to notice patterns, but always long enough to identify potential victims. In 1982, he was working at a summer camp in Ohio when 12-year-old Michael Dennis went missing during a camping trip. Michael was found 3 days later in a shallow grave 2 miles from the campsite. He had been strangled. Moust helped organize the search parties. He comforted the other children. He even spoke at Michael's memorial service about what a special boy he had been. The investigation focused on potential outsiders who might have wandered onto the camp property. It never occurred to anyone to seriously investigate the staff members who had access to the children every day. The pattern continued throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Moust would appear at a facility, work there for a few months, and then move on. Sometimes a child would disappear during his tenure. Sometimes the disappearance would happen weeks or months after he left, making the connection even harder to spot. He was careful never to take more than one child from any single location. He varied his methods. Sometimes the bodies were found, sometimes they weren't. Sometimes the deaths looked accidental, sometimes they looked like murders committed by strangers. What investigators later discovered was that Moust kept detailed records of his crimes. Hidden in various storage units across multiple states, he maintained journals, photographs, and what could only be described as trophies. The journals revealed the depth of his planning and the coldness of his calculations. He would spend weeks studying potential victims, learning their routines, their fears, their family situations. He wrote about which children would be missed quickly and which ones might disappear without anyone noticing for days or weeks. The photographs were even more disturbing. They showed not just his victims, but dozens of other children he had encountered over the years. Kids at camps, kids at group homes, kids at youth centers. All of them cataloged, all of them studied, all of them potential targets. Some of the photos were taken without the children's knowledge. Others showed kids who clearly trusted him, smiling at the camera, unaware they were being documented by a predator. The trophies varied depending on the victim. Sometimes it was a piece of clothing, sometimes it was a toy or a personal item, sometimes it was something more grotesque. Each trophy was carefully labeled with the victim's name, the date, and the location. Moust treated his crimes like a collection, something to be organized and preserved and occasionally revisited. What finally brought him down wasn't good police work or institutional oversight. It was pure chance. In 2003, while working at a group home in Illinois, Moust made a mistake. He tried to lure away a boy who had an older brother in the same facility. When the younger boy disappeared during what was supposed to be a supervised outing, the older brother immediately suspected something was wrong. Unlike many of Moust's previous victims, this boy had someone who cared about him, someone who knew his habits and would notice immediately when he failed to return. The older brother's insistence that something had happened to his sibling forced authorities to take the disappearance seriously from the beginning. They quickly discovered that Moust's story about the supervised outing didn't match the facts. When they searched his apartment, they found items belonging to the missing boy. When they dug deeper into his background, they discovered the pattern of employment at youth facilities stretching back decades. The storage units were discovered during the investigation into that single disappearance. What police found there was evidence of a killing spree that had lasted nearly 30 years. The final count was 17 confirmed victims, all boys between the ages of 10 and 16. But investigators believe the real number was much higher. Many of Moust's employment records were incomplete or had been destroyed. Many of the facilities where he worked had closed down over the years, taking their records with them. During his confession, Moust showed no remorse. He described his crimes in clinical detail, talking about the victims like they were objects rather than human beings. When asked why he had targeted children, his answer was chillingly simple. They were easy. They trusted adults. They were often isolated from family support systems, and the institutions that were supposed to protect them were more concerned with avoiding scandal than with investigating potential threats. Moust was sentenced to death in 2005. He spent the next 8 years on death row, largely forgotten by the media and the public. He died of natural causes in 2013 before his execution could be carried out. Even in death, he managed to escape full accountability for his crimes. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the David Moust case isn't what he did, it's how easily he was able to do it. For 3 decades, he moved through the child welfare system like a virus, exploiting every weakness, every gap in oversight, every moment of institutional inattention. He understood that the very people and places meant to protect vulnerable children were often the least equipped to recognize threats from within. The facilities where Moust worked were dealing with overcrowding, understaffing, and constant budget pressures. Background checks were often superficial, references were rarely verified thoroughly, and once someone was hired, ongoing supervision was minimal. Moust knew that as long as he kept a low profile and didn't cause obvious problems, he could operate with near impunity. Even more troubling was the way these institutions responded when children did disappear. Rather than investigating thoroughly, they often chose the explanation that caused the least disruption. A runaway was easier to explain than a murder. An accident was preferable to negligence, and the possibility that a staff member might be responsible was almost unthinkable because acknowledging that reality would mean admitting that the entire system had failed. The children Moust targeted were chosen specifically because they were disposable in the eyes of society. Many were from broken homes, many had behavioral problems, many had already been written off by their families, their schools, their communities. When they disappeared, there was often no one with the resources or the persistence to demand answers. The system that was supposed to protect them instead made them invisible. This invisibility is what allowed Moust to kill for 30 years without being caught. It's what allows predators like him to continue operating today. Because as long as society treats certain children as less valuable, as long as the institutions meant to protect them are underfunded and under-scrutinized, there will always be David Mousts ready to exploit those vulnerabilities. The case files on David Moust are still being reviewed today, decades after his death. New victims are still being identified. New connections are still being made. Because when a predator operates for 30 years across multiple states and dozens of institutions, the full scope of the damage may never be completely understood. What we do know is that 17 families lost their children to a man who should never have been allowed near them in the first place. 17 boys who deserved protection instead found predation. 17 lives cut short because the systems meant to help them failed in the most fundamental way possible. And David Moust, like all the killers we've discussed, wasn't some supernatural monster. He was a human being who made deliberate choices to cause harm. He was enabled by institutional failures, societal indifference, and systemic gaps that still exist today. His story is a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Our journey through these 5 forgotten monsters reveals something deeply unsettling about the world we live in. Each of these killers operated not in the shadows of some distant nightmare, but within the very systems designed to protect us. They walked among us, worked beside us, lived ordinary lives while harboring extraordinary darkness. Dennis Nilsson invited men into his home, offering warmth and companionship to those society had already discarded. Wayne Adam Ford drove the highways of California, appearing as just another trucker to the women he would ultimately destroy. Joel Cauchy stalked the streets of Sydney and Melbourne, blending into crowds while selecting his victims with calculated precision. David Edward Moust gained access to vulnerable children through the very institutions meant to safeguard them, and Andrei Chikatilo rode the trains and buses of the Soviet Union for over a decade, hiding behind a facade of respectability while the system itself refused to acknowledge his existence. What makes these cases so terrifying isn't just the brutality of their crimes, but how easily they moved through society undetected. They exploited the gaps in our systems, the blind spots in our communities, and the prejudices that make us look away from certain types of victims. The homeless man sleeping rough, the sex worker walking alone, the runaway teenager, the foster child with no family advocate, the young woman traveling by herself, these were the people our killers targeted because they understood with chilling clarity that these victims would be missed less, investigated less thoroughly, mourned more quietly. Consider the institutional failures that enabled their sprees. Police departments that didn't communicate across jurisdictions, allowing killers to simply move to new hunting grounds when the heat got too intense. Social services that shuffled problem cases between facilities without proper background checks or oversight. Mental health systems that released dangerous individuals without adequate follow-up or community protection. Law enforcement agencies that dismissed reports from marginalized communities or treated certain types of victims as less worthy of investigation. These weren't random acts of violence committed by wild-eyed madmen. These were calculated, methodical predators who understood exactly how to exploit the weaknesses in our social fabric. They studied their environments, identified the most vulnerable targets, and developed sophisticated methods of avoiding detection. They maintained jobs, relationships, and public personas that provided perfect cover for their true activities. The most chilling aspect of these cases is how ordinary these men appeared to those around them. Nilsson seemed like a quiet civil servant who kept to himself. Ford was described as a reliable employee and devoted father. Cauchy appeared to be a struggling young man trying to find his place in the world. Moust was seen as a caring youth counselor dedicated to helping troubled children. Chikatilo was viewed as an educated professional, a teacher and engineer who contributed to his community. This ordinariness wasn't accidental, it was camouflage. These killers understood that the best way to avoid suspicion was to appear completely unremarkable. They cultivated personas that would never draw scrutiny, lived lives that seemed so normal they became invisible. They recognized that society's monsters aren't the ones who look like monsters, they're the ones who look like everyone else. The victims they chose tell us something equally disturbing about our society's priorities. These killers specifically targeted people on the margins, people whose disappearances wouldn't immediately trigger massive investigations or media attention. They understood that a missing homeless person generates less urgency than a missing college student from a middle class family. They knew that the death of a sex worker receives less investigative resources than the death of a suburban mother. They calculated correctly that society's response would be muted when the victims came from populations we prefer not to think about. This selective victimization reveals uncomfortable truths about how we value human life. While these killers were undoubtedly evil, they were also shrewd observers of social dynamics. They recognized which lives matter less in the eyes of institutions and media, and they exploited that knowledge ruthlessly. Their victim selection wasn't random, it was strategic, based on a cold assessment of whose deaths would generate the least heat. The geographic spread of their crimes also tells a story about modern life and its vulnerabilities. These weren't killers confined to single communities where their activities might be noticed. They were mobile predators who understood that movement equals anonymity. Nielsen moved between different areas of London. Ford traveled the highways of multiple states. Cauchy operated across different Australian cities. Maust shifted between various institutions, and Chikatilo used the Soviet transportation system to access victims across a vast territory. This mobility was both a product of modern society and a weapon against it. The same systems that allow legitimate movement and opportunity, the highways, public transportation, employment networks, social services, also create opportunities for predators to exploit. These killers turned the infrastructure of modern life into hunting grounds, using our interconnected world against us. Perhaps most disturbing is how long they were able to operate. These weren't brief crime sprees that burned out quickly. Nielsen killed for years in the same London borough. Ford's crimes spanned multiple states over an extended period. Cauchy's attacks occurred over several years across different cities. Maust abused children for decades while moving between institutions. Chikatilo's reign of terror lasted over 12 years and spanned hundreds of miles. Their longevity wasn't due to superior intelligence or criminal genius. It was due to systemic failures, institutional blindness, and societal indifference. They succeeded because the systems meant to catch them were inadequate, uncoordinated, and often more concerned with maintaining appearances than confronting uncomfortable realities. They thrived in the gaps between jurisdictions, the spaces between agencies, the blind spots created by prejudice and neglect. These cases force us to confront difficult questions about the society we've built and the systems we've created to protect ourselves. How many other predators are operating right now, hiding in plain sight, exploiting the same vulnerabilities these killers exploited? How many victims are being ignored because they don't fit our image of who deserves protection and justice? How many warning signs are we missing because we're not looking in the right places or listening to the right voices? The legacy of these forgotten killers isn't just the lives they took or the families they destroyed. It's the reminder that evil often wears an ordinary face, that our systems of protection have serious flaws, and that some of the most dangerous predators are those who understand exactly how to blend in. They succeeded not despite our civilized society, but because of its weaknesses, blind spots, and prejudices. Their stories serve as a dark mirror, reflecting back our own failures and forcing us to acknowledge that the monsters we fear most aren't the obvious ones. They're the ones sitting next to us on the bus, working in the cubicle down the hall, volunteering at the local shelter, teaching our children. They're the ones who have learned to weaponize our trust, exploit our systems, and hide behind our assumptions about what evil looks like. These five killers remind us that the price of safety isn't just vigilance, it's justice, equality, and a society that values all lives equally. Until we address the systemic failures that allowed them to operate, until we close the gaps they exploited, until we extend our protection to all members of society, regardless of their circumstances, we remain vulnerable to the next predator who understands how to hide in plain sight. The most evil serial killers you've never heard of succeeded because they understood something we often prefer to ignore, that monsters don't announce themselves with fanfare or obvious warning signs. They simply wait, watch, and strike when our systems fail and our attention turns away. These stories reveal something chilling about the nature of evil itself. It's not always the boogeyman hiding in the shadows or the deranged lunatic screaming in the streets. Sometimes, evil wears a smile, holds down a job, and lives quietly next door. Sometimes it exploits the very systems we've built to protect ourselves, turning our blind spots into hunting grounds. Dennis Nilsen seemed like a gentle civil servant who wouldn't hurt a fly. Wayne Adam Ford appeared to be just another trucker passing through. Joel Cauchy was a quiet man battling mental illness. David Edward Moust was a drifter who blended into the background. Andrei Chikatilo was a teacher, a Communist Party member, a man society trusted with children. Yet between them, they destroyed hundreds of lives, leaving families shattered and communities scarred. What's most disturbing isn't just what they did, but how they did it. They understood something fundamental about human nature that we'd rather not acknowledge. They knew that society has a hierarchy of victims. They knew that certain people disappear without anyone caring enough to look. They knew that bureaucracy creates gaps, that prejudice creates blindness, and that indifference creates opportunity. Nielsen targeted young men from the margins, gay men at a time when society barely acknowledged their existence. Ford preyed on sex workers and transients, people whose lives were already precarious. Cauchy chose victims in a moment of chaos where help couldn't arrive fast enough. Moust exploited the vulnerability of runaway children and homeless adults. Chikatilo hunted in a system so corrupt and incompetent that it protected him for decades. These weren't random acts of violence. They were calculated exploitations of societal weaknesses. Each killer found their niche, their perfect storm of victim vulnerability and systemic failure. They operated like parasites, feeding on the parts of society we'd rather ignore. The most chilling realization is how long they all managed to continue. Nielsen killed for 5 years before being caught by accident. Ford murdered for over a decade before his guilt consumed him. Cauchy's mental health deteriorated for years before anyone intervened effectively. Moust drifted through the system for decades, leaving bodies across multiple states. Chikatilo terrorized an entire region for 12 years while authorities chased shadows. They succeeded because they understood that certain victims don't matter enough to most people. They knew that homelessness makes you invisible, that mental illness makes you expendable, that poverty makes you forgettable. They counted on police being overworked, systems being underfunded, and society being too comfortable to care about the uncomfortable truths. But perhaps the most unsettling truth is that these men weren't monsters from birth. They were created by the same society they would later prey upon. Childhood abuse, institutional neglect, systemic failures, and social indifference shaped them into the predators they became. It's a vicious cycle where society's failures create the very monsters that exploit those same failures. This doesn't excuse their actions, nothing could, but it does force us to confront an uncomfortable reality. These killers succeeded because we, as a society, allowed them to. Every homeless person we walk past without seeing, every mentally ill individual we dismiss, every marginalized community we ignore, creates the conditions these predators thrive in. The real horror isn't that these 5 men existed, it's that they represent a pattern that continues today. Right now, somewhere in the world, another predator is studying society's blind spots, identifying the vulnerable, and preparing to exploit our collective indifference. They're counting on our prejudices, our bureaucratic failures, and our willingness to look the other way when the victims aren't people we identify with. The greatest weapon these killers possessed wasn't violence or cunning. It was our own neglect. They succeeded because we failed to see, failed to care, and failed to act. They turned our society's weaknesses into their strengths, our blind spots into their hunting grounds. These stories should serve as more than just entertainment or morbid curiosity. They should be warnings, mirrors that reflect back our own complicity in creating the conditions that allow such evil to flourish. Until we address the systemic issues that create vulnerable populations, until we care as much about the marginalized as we do about the privileged, until we build systems that actually protect rather than simply punish, we'll continue to create the very monsters we fear. The most evil serial killers you've never heard of succeeded not because they were uniquely evil, but because they were uniquely aware of how evil our indifference could be. They saw the cracks in our humanity and crawled through them. The question isn't whether such monsters exist, it's whether we'll continue to create the conditions that allow them to thrive.